I asked 100-year-olds about their biggest regrets. Here's what they said. I once asked a woman who was 104 years old a question I thought would take maybe 30 seconds to answer. I said, "If you could go back and change one thing about your life, what would it be?" She looked down at her coffee for a while, real quiet. Then she smiled a little and said, "Only one?" That answer stayed with me, because over the last few years, I've sat with people in their late 80s, 90s, even over 100 years old. Different lives, different personalities, different histories. But when the conversation got honest enough, the same regrets kept showing up. Not regrets about money, not status, not careers. The real regrets were quieter than that. And once you hear them, you start looking at your own life a little differently. I think one of the saddest things about getting old is that people stop asking you real questions. People ask about medication, doctor visits, blood pressure, sleep, but almost nobody asks, what did your life actually feel like? So I started asking, and something unexpected happened. A lot of these conversations became less about aging and more about being human. Some of these people laughed while talking. Some cried. Some stared out the window for a long time before answering. A few of them admitted things they said they had never spoken out loud before. And today, I want to share 5 regrets I heard again and again. Not because these people are broken by regret. Actually, most of them had a kind of peace about them. But they wanted younger people to understand something before time moves too fast. Regret number 1. I lived too much of my life for other people. Dorothy was 96 years old when I met her. Former school teacher. Very polite, very sharp. The kind of woman who still folds napkins neatly before sitting down. When I asked her about regret, she laughed immediately. Not because it was funny, more like because she already knew the answer. She told me,
I spent most of my life trying not to disappoint anybody. Good wife, good mother, good employee, good daughter. I got so used to being who everybody needed me to be that eventually I stopped asking myself what I wanted at all. And then something that honestly hit me hard.
She said, people complimented the version of me that made their lives easier. That line sat heavy in the room. Dorothy told me her retirement party was the first time she realized how invisible she felt inside her own life. Everybody was thanking her for being dependable, reliable, selfless. And she remembered sitting there thinking, but nobody here really knows me. Not deeply anyway. At 72 years old, Dorothy started writing in notebooks, not for publishing, not for social media, not for family, just for herself. She said it felt strange at first, like meeting somebody she should have known years ago. When I asked her what she would tell younger people now, she paused for a long moment and said, "Do not spend your whole life earning approval from people who are mostly thinking about themselves." That was the first regret I kept hearing. People waiting too long to become themselves. Regret number 2. I stayed too long. Henry was different. 91 years old, former engineer, very dry sense of humor. When I asked him about regret, he answered almost immediately. I stayed too long. That was it. Then he explained. Too long in a marriage that stopped feeling loving years earlier. Too long at a job he never actually enjoyed. Too long pretending he was fine because stability sounded responsible. He told me something I wrote down the second I got home. He said,
A lot of people confuse familiarity with happiness. I think that's true. Because sometimes people do not stay because they are fulfilled. They stay because leaving feels frightening.
Henry said by the time he retired, he had become so disconnected from himself that his doctor once asked him, "What do you enjoy doing?" And he genuinely could not answer. Not because he was stupid, because he had spent decades surviving instead of paying attention to himself. That part really bothered him. But here's the interesting thing. Henry didn't tell his story like a tragedy. At 84, he started woodworking, built chairs, tables, birdhouses, mostly gives them away now. And while he was showing me one of the chairs he built, he ran his hand across the wood and said quietly, "I think this is the first thing I ever made that actually felt like me." Not successful, not practical. Him. Now let me say something important here. A lot of people hear stories like this and think, well, that was their generation. But sitting across from these people, what shocked me most was how fresh the regret still felt. Not old, fresh. Like emotionally they were still standing inside those moments. And the sentence I heard over and over again was, I really thought I had more time. Regret number 3. I never said what needed to be said. Margaret was 88. Very warm woman. Soft voice. The type of person who apologizes if you pour her coffee before she pours yours. She grew up in a family where nobody talked openly about emotions. You kept moving. You kept working. You kept difficult feelings to yourself. And for most of her life, she thought that was strength. Then she told me about her mother. Apparently, they had a fight when Margaret was in her 30s. Nothing dramatic, no screaming, no huge family explosion. But underneath the argument were years of things Margaret never knew how to say. That she wanted to feel understood. That she sometimes felt emotionally invisible growing up. That she loved her mother deeply, but never felt fully known by her. And none of it ever got said. Her mother died unexpectedly a few years later. Margaret told me something I haven't forgotten since. She said,
You can survive an argument. It's the unfinished conversation that follows you forever.
Not long after that, she started a tradition with her grandchildren. Once a year, she sits down with each one privately and asks, Is there anything between us we should talk about while we still can? I remember asking her if those conversations were uncomfortable. She smiled and said, Not nearly as uncomfortable as regret. Regret number 4. I was too busy for the life I was building. Robert was 95, built a successful hardware business from almost nothing. Very respected man in his town. But during our conversation, he kept staring at this old photograph hanging on the wall beside him. It was his daughter as a little girl running through a sprinkler in the backyard. And he finally pointed at it and said, I missed a lot of that. He clarified something important after saying it. He wasn't talking about birthdays or Christmas. He showed up for the major moments. What haunted him were the ordinary days. Tuesday evenings, random dinners, little conversations he barely noticed at the time. He said,
You always think there will be more ordinary days.
That line honestly changed the way I think about life. Because he was right. Most of life is not dramatic. Most of life is Tuesday. And Robert said while he was busy building a future for his family, the present quietly disappeared. He looked at me and said,
My children did not need a perfect provider nearly as much as they needed a present father.
That room got very quiet after he said that. And before I left, he added one more thing. He said,
Work expands forever if you let it. Childhood doesn't.
Regret number 5. I kept waiting to be happy. And then there was Clara, 103 years old, still funny, still sharp, still completely honest. She told me her biggest regret in one sentence.
I kept waiting for life to begin. For decades, I thought happiness was always somewhere in the future, after retirement, after stress, after things calmed down, after responsibilities became lighter. But that peaceful season never fully arrived. Life stayed messy. People got sick. Bills appeared. Time moved faster. And one day I realized I had spent most of my life postponing joy.
She laughed while telling me this story about her good dishes. Apparently, she used to save them for special occasions. And one day in her 80s, she looked at the cabinet and thought, what exactly am I waiting for? After that, she started using the nice dishes on random Tuesdays, started calling old friends, started dancing in her kitchen while cooking. Small things, but she said those small things made her feel alive again. Before I left, Clara grabbed my hand surprisingly hard for a 103-year-old woman and said, Please don't wait until your life is nearly over to give yourself permission to enjoy it. That might have been the quietest sentence anybody said to me during these conversations, and maybe the most important. 5 people, different lives, different personalities, different mistakes. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. None of them regretted taking too many chances. they regretted hesitation, the words they never said, the happiness they postponed, the years they spent trying to become acceptable instead of honest, the moments they assumed would still be there later. And maybe that is what wisdom actually is. Not becoming fearless, just realizing time is moving whether you pay attention or not. One thing I noticed after almost every conversation was this. Even the people carrying regret still found ways to return to life. Dorothy started writing. Henry started building. Margaret started speaking honestly. Robert started showing up more. Clara started enjoying ordinary days. None of them were trying to become young again. They just stopped postponing themselves. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not perfection, not productivity, not success, just presence. So tonight, or tomorrow morning, or whenever this video finds you, call somebody, say the thing, take the walk, use the good dishes, spend time with your people. Because eventually all of us reach a moment where we realize the ordinary days were the life. And before you leave this video, I want to ask you the same question they kept asking me. Are you actually living or just waiting?